The airplane hummed softly as it soared above the clouds, its sleek body cutting through the sky with a quiet power that was almost comforting. Inside, the atmosphere was calm and luxurious. The first-class cabin was bathed in the warm glow of ambient lighting, the plush leather seats arranged in neat rows, the rich scent of high-end perfume mixed with the faint trace of freshly polished wood, creating an environment of quiet sophistication. Soft classical music played from the overhead speakers, barely perceptible but adding to the tranquility. Elaine settled into her seat, the world outside the window a blur of blue sky and white clouds. She was in her early 40s, composed, polished, and dressed in a tailored black suit that hinted at power without boasting. Her raven black hair was neatly pulled back, and her high heels clicked decisively as she moved through the aisle, carrying with her an air of quiet authority. She wasn't just any businesswoman heading to a meeting, she was an attorney known for her razor-sharp mind and unshakable demeanor. Elaine's reputation preceded her, but she preferred to keep a low profile, especially during her travels. As she adjusted the seat belt and settled in, the plane's steady hum offered a sense of reassurance. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. She opened her leather briefcase, a sleek, minimalist design, and took out a few papers to review. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering a friendly, routine service. The air inside the cabin seemed serene, untouched by anything that could disrupt its calm. One of the attendants, Amanda, appeared by Elaine's side. She was in her mid-30s, with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Amanda wore the uniform with precision, her hair tightly pulled into a neat bun. At first glance, she seemed polite, a standard, professional flight attendant, nothing out of the ordinary. She offered Elaine a smile, but there was something off about it, a slight tightness at the corners of her mouth that hinted at an underlying unease. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" Amanda asked, her voice measured but lacking the warmth that typically accompanied such an inquiry. Elaine glanced up from her papers, raising an eyebrow slightly. "I'll have a glass of white wine, please." "Of course." Amanda's tone was polite, but her eyes lingered just a moment too long before she turned to fetch the drink. It wasn't a significant moment, but something about it made Elaine's brow furrow. She couldn't quite place it, but Amanda's smile was a little too stiff, her movements just a tad too deliberate. Elaine turned back to her papers, dismissing the fleeting thought. There was no need to dwell on it. She was just being sensitive, perhaps too aware of the subtleties in the way people interacted with her. After all, she had been in high-pressure environments for so long that she had learned to read people like open books. Still, something felt a little off. A few minutes later, Amanda returned with the wine. She placed the glass on the tray table in front of Elaine, her hands moving with calculated precision. Elaine nodded her thanks, a polite smile on her face, but again, the interaction felt just slightly more rigid than it should have. Amanda didn't meet her eyes for more than a second before turning and walking away. Elaine took a sip from the glass, enjoying the crisp taste, but the sense that something wasn't quite right lingered. Amanda's tone had been almost dismissive, but in a way that was hard to pinpoint. The brief moment of contact had been a perfect example of the subtle kind of disrespect that Elaine had grown accustomed to handling. People who didn't quite know how to engage with someone like her, someone who was used to being in control. Still, it wasn't something worth confronting. The flight was going smoothly, and she had a meeting ahead of her, one that would take all of her focus. As the flight continued, the cabin remained quiet, passengers relaxing in their own worlds. Yet, in the back of Elaine's mind, the feeling that something was brewing wouldn't go away. It was as though she had caught a glimpse of a storm on the horizon, just a faint crack in the sky, but enough to make her uneasy. Elaine closed her briefcase and leaned back in her seat, trying to let go of the nagging feeling that had taken root. Maybe it was nothing. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds below them, seemingly endless. Everything was normal, and yet, she couldn't shake the sense that something unexpected was about to unfold. The hum of the plane, the soft chatter of passengers, the distant clink of drink carts, it all seemed like the usual rhythm of flight, but deep down, Elaine could feel it. Something was changing, just below the surface, something she couldn't see yet, but she knew it was coming. She just didn't know what it would look like when it arrived. As the plane ascended higher, Amanda moved past again, this time with a subtle glance toward Elaine. The exchange was brief, but there was something different this time, a flicker of something more than politeness. For a split second, the mask of professionalism seemed to slip. It was subtle, but enough for Elaine to notice. Amanda's smile didn't quite match the coolness in her eyes, and the polite hum of her voice seemed more forced. The tension, though still unspoken, was building. Something was about to happen. Elaine just didn't know what yet. Elaine had always been good at keeping her composure, especially in situations where small irritations could easily spiral into bigger problems. As a successful attorney, she had learned early on how to read people, how to manage difficult personalities, and how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. The more she tried to dismiss the nagging sense that something was off with Amanda, the stronger it became. At first, it had been a vague feeling, an odd tone, an unspoken dismissiveness. But now, Elaine could feel the tension in the air thickening, and she knew this wasn't a mere case of misunderstanding. Something was happening here, and it was no longer just a matter of small, insignificant slights. It started with something simple. Elaine had finished her wine and pressed the call button for the flight attendant. Her flight was long, and though she was used to the hustle of airports and meetings, she couldn't help but appreciate the rare moment of quiet. A small part of her was hoping that Amanda would offer a second drink, perhaps with a bit more warmth this time. The previous interaction had been far from unpleasant, but it wasn't the type of encounter one would expect from a high-end flight service. When Amanda appeared, Elaine smiled politely. "Could I please have another glass of white wine?" Amanda glanced down at her with what could only be described as a disinterested look. "You should be careful with that. Wouldn't want you getting too tipsy for your meeting," she said, her voice a touch too cold, a touch too sharp. Elaine wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but there was an edge to Amanda's words, something that felt less like concern and more like a subtle jab. The flight attendant turned quickly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, as if she was trying to end the conversation before it could even start. Elaine blinked, taken aback. She was used to people making assumptions about her, especially in a professional setting where her success and polished appearance often led to judgments. But this was different. It wasn't about her work. It felt like Amanda was making a personal comment, veiled in the guise of politeness. "I'm fine," Elaine muttered under her breath, but there was no time to dwell on it. She returned to her papers, flipping through them with practiced efficiency. Still, the words rang in her ears. "Too tipsy for your meeting." The phrase echoed through her mind, making her question the tone in which it had been said. Was Amanda mocking her? When Amanda returned, she handed the wine over without a word, her actions quick and mechanical. She didn't wait for a thank you, didn't offer any small pleasantries, just a swift transaction. "Thank you," Elaine said, keeping her voice steady. She took the glass, her fingers brushing against the cool stem. The glass felt foreign in her hand, the subtle distaste she now felt making her more aware of every little movement in the cabin. At first, Elaine thought it was just a rough day for Amanda. Maybe she had too much to deal with. Maybe she was exhausted from the endless hours of flight duties, but something deep inside Elaine told her that this wasn't simply a case of bad timing. No, there was something deeper at play, and it was only going to get worse. The next moment that sent a ripple through the air occurred when Elaine, adjusting her dress, shifted in her seat slightly to find a more comfortable position. The dress was elegant, yet tight enough to limit her range of movement. It wasn't an issue when she was standing, but when she was seated for long hours, it could be uncomfortable. She pressed the call button again, this time a bit more hesitant. "Amanda, would it be possible to get a little more space? My dress is a bit tight," Elaine asked, trying to keep her tone neutral, but the edges of her patience were beginning to fray. Amanda appeared after a moment, her eyes flicking briefly over Elaine's form before she replied, her tone colder this time. "We have limited space here, ma'am. You'll have to make do," she said curtly, before turning to walk away without waiting for a response. Elaine blinked in surprise, her mouth slightly open. It wasn't just the refusal that stung, it was the way Amanda had dismissed her, as though her discomfort was nothing more than an inconvenience. She had asked for something simple, something that would have made her trip a bit more bearable. But Amanda's response was less than accommodating. The lack of empathy stung, but there was something even more unsettling about the way Amanda had looked at her. It was almost as if she had dismissed Elaine not because of the request, but because of who she assumed Elaine was, or, more accurately, who she assumed she wasn't. Was it her dress? Elaine thought, her mind racing. The expensive fabric, the polished appearance, perhaps it had sparked something in Amanda. Maybe she assumed she was just another rich woman, one who didn't need to be treated with any special care. At that moment, the simmering tension between them started to grow. Elaine, always composed, had never been someone to react impulsively. She had spent years building a reputation based on professionalism and calm demeanor, knowing that reacting to small slights could be seen as weakness. But this was different. The dismissiveness in Amanda's voice, the subtle way she had mocked Elaine's need for space, felt personal. The whole situation was becoming more uncomfortable by the minute, and the more Elaine tried to push it out of her mind, the more it lingered. As if to further deepen the awkwardness, Amanda passed by again a few minutes later, this time leaning in with a small, sharp smile. "I see you're still making do," she remarked, her words thinly veiled with sarcasm. Elaine looked up, her eyes locking with Amanda's. The subtle tension that had been building was now tangible, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Elaine's patience was wearing thin. "I'm sure it's fine," Elaine replied, keeping her voice steady, but the words felt like they were laced with something else, something brittle, something sharp. She could feel her control slipping. Amanda's eyes narrowed slightly, but before she could respond, Elaine turned her gaze back to the window, refusing to engage any further. For a moment, the silence between them seemed to fill the cabin. There was no going back now. The exchange, small as it seemed, had set the stage for what was to come. The calm facade of the flight was beginning to crack, revealing the deeper layers of tension that neither of them could ignore. Elaine exhaled slowly, a mix of frustration and disbelief bubbling up inside her. She had tried to dismiss the discomfort, to give Amanda the benefit of the doubt, but now it was clear, this was no accident. The dissonance between them wasn't simply a matter of personality clashes or a bad mood. There was something more insidious at play, something more personal. As Elaine sat there, waiting for what would come next, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pushed into something she wasn't ready for, and deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The tension was growing, and it was clear that Amanda's actions were no longer just an inconvenience. Something darker was emerging, and Elaine had a feeling that it wasn't going to be something she could ignore for much longer. The cabin had grown unnervingly quiet, the hum of the engines and the rustle of papers, the only sounds that seemed to fill the space. The tension was palpable, an almost suffocating weight in the air that seemed to press against Elaine's chest with every passing moment. The polite veneer between her and Amanda had long since shattered, leaving behind only the raw, jagged edges of something darker. Elaine sat with her back straight, her fingers gripping the armrests, her eyes glued to the window, but the world outside felt distant. She had tried to dismiss the growing discomfort, tried to convince herself that this was nothing, just a flight, just a passing annoyance. but as the seconds ticked by, the small acts of disrespect had morphed into something uglier, something she couldn't ignore anymore. Amanda had passed by a few minutes ago, but this time there was no polite smile, no subtle remark. She walked past Elaine with a sharp glance, her eyes lingering on the luxurious fabric of Elaine's dress. The first time, Amanda had given her an offhand comment about the tightness of her dress. This time, however, there was no attempt at pretense, no words, just a look, cold and dismissive, as if she could see through Elaine's carefully curated exterior, as though she was beneath her. Elaine couldn't let it go. The comment, the tone, the way Amanda looked at her, as though she were some kind of interloper. She had enough. Standing up, her heels clicking against the floor in a determined rhythm, Elaine followed Amanda down the aisle, the surge of anger boiling beneath her skin. Amanda. Elaine's voice was steady, but there was a firmness there that couldn't be ignored. The flight attendant turned slowly, as though she had been expecting this moment. Yes, ma'am. Amanda's tone was icy, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She was already aware that Elaine was upset, but she seemed to find the situation almost amusing. "I need to speak to you," Elaine said, her voice low but cutting. "You've been rude to me since I boarded this flight, and I want to know why." Amanda's expression didn't shift. She raised an eyebrow, tilting her head in mock curiosity. "Rude? I'm just doing my job, ma'am. If you can't handle the attention your designer dress brings, maybe you should reconsider your wardrobe." The words were a pointed jab, meant to sting, and Elaine felt her breath catch in her throat. Her heart raced as the words hit harder than she expected. "You think I can't handle it? You've been treating me like I don't belong here, as if my presence here is some kind of mistake. I paid for this seat. I deserve the same respect as anyone else on this flight," Elaine replied, her voice rising. She wasn't trying to control the situation anymore. It was clear that Amanda was trying to provoke her, to break her. And yet, Elaine still held onto her composure, even though the words scraped at her very core. She would not let this woman reduce her to some object of ridicule. Not now, not ever. Amanda's lips curled into a mocking smile, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, you deserve respect. From who, exactly?" She paused, letting the words linger in the air. Then, in a move that was far too quick, too sudden, she reached out, her fingers curling around the edge of Elaine's dress. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Time slowed as Amanda's fingers clenched tighter around the delicate fabric of the dress, and with a sharp, violent pull, the sound of ripping fabric echoed through the stillness. The sound was jarring, like a violent crack that split the air. Elaine's eyes widened in shock as she felt the sharp tug at her body, the weight of the fabric tearing beneath Amanda's fingers. "How about now?" Amanda sneered, as though she had won some silent victory. Elaine stood frozen for a moment, the shock of the tear surging through her like electricity. Her dress, the one she had chosen so carefully, the one that made her feel powerful and confident, was now marred. She could feel the rip, small at first, just below her hip, as if the fabric had been pulled apart by the force of Amanda's malice. For a brief, heart-stopping second, Elaine was speechless, her breath coming in shallow gasps as her fingers brushed against the tear. She had never been humiliated in such a way. But the moment passed, and with it, the decision. Elaine straightened her back, standing tall despite the burning embarrassment. She met Amanda's gaze, refusing to let her see any weakness, any crack in her carefully crafted exterior. She swallowed hard, then spoke, her voice unwavering. "You've crossed a line. You may not respect me, but I demand that you respect my space. My presence here is no less valid than anyone else's, and you have no right to treat me this way." The anger that burned in her chest now found its outlet, each word sharper than the last. The public humiliation she had endured, the sting of the tear in her dress, fueled the fire of her words. The other passengers were beginning to take notice. Heads turned, eyes widened in surprise as they observed the growing confrontation. Amanda, still standing in front of her, blinked a few times, seemingly taken aback by Elaine's forceful response. But she quickly regained her composure, her lips curling into a tight, cold smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, her voice oozing insincerity. "I didn't realize I was offending you. Perhaps you should take your complaint to the captain." She turned her back on Elaine with a dismissive wave, as though the issue was beneath her. Elaine stood there, chest heaving, still seething with anger. The adrenaline of the confrontation hadn't yet worn off, and her heart pounded loudly in her ears. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some staring in curiosity, others clearly uncomfortable at the spectacle that had unfolded before them. But Elaine didn't care. This wasn't just about a dress. It wasn't even about the rude comments. It was about something deeper: the cruelty, the disrespect, the subtle yet glaring assumption that she didn't belong here, that she was less than. And now, the entire cabin had witnessed it. The power dynamics had shifted. Elaine wasn't just a passive recipient of Amanda's mistreatment anymore. She was standing her ground. She had drawn the line. Amanda had underestimated her, and now, there was no going back. The quiet murmur of passengers, who had once watched the confrontation with a mixture of shock and curiosity, now seemed to swell into a low hum of murmurs. Every eye in the cabin was drawn to Elaine, still standing tall, her expression unreadable, the rip in her designer dress a glaring symbol of the humiliation she'd endured. The atmosphere, once tense with discomfort, had shifted. It felt electric, charged with anticipation, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Elaine stood there, the harsh words of the flight attendant echoing in her mind. Amanda's dismissive smirk still lingered in her thoughts, but her emotions had settled into a quiet, steely resolve. She could feel the weight of the eyes upon her, the judgment, the curiosity, and the whispers behind her back, but none of it fazed her. In fact, it only served to strengthen her calm demeanor, to reinforce her control over the situation. The passengers, it seemed, were waiting for the next move. The murmurs had quieted down, and Amanda, still standing in front of her, seemed to be hesitating, as if unsure of how to proceed. Her cool exterior, the one she'd maintained up until this point, was beginning to crack. The earlier arrogance had been replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, her eyes darting around as if seeking escape. Elaine had no intention of letting her off the hook. Her lips curled into a calm, but chilling smile, one that was as measured as it was lethal. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," she said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who was used to commanding attention. Amanda blinked, confusion momentarily flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice defensive, but still dripping with condescension. Elaine took a step forward, her heels clicking firmly against the cabin floor, asserting her presence. The passengers had been watching closely, but now, as Elaine's words echoed through the quiet plane, their eyes seemed to widen in realization. "I'm Elaine Parker," she continued, her tone calm and deliberate, her every word weighed with precision. "You may not recognize the name, but I'm a high-powered attorney. I specialize in high-profile legal cases, often involving situations exactly like this one." The words hit the cabin like a bombshell. The murmurs that had been simmering now exploded into a flurry of whispers. Elaine could almost hear the collective gasp of disbelief as the other passengers began to shift in their seats. Amanda's face, which had been cold and dismissive just moments ago, was now flushed with sudden panic. The casual sneer she had been holding onto faltered, and her lips parted, as if unsure of how to respond. Elaine didn't wait for an answer. "I handle corporate legal battles, race discrimination cases, and wrongful conduct lawsuits for some of the world's most powerful clients." She watched Amanda's face carefully, noticing the first signs of nervousness creeping in, the way her eyes darted away from Elaine's unblinking gaze. What you've just done to me is not something that will go unnoticed. It's illegal. And it's something I have dealt with countless times in my career." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. What had been a tense, uncomfortable encounter between two strangers now felt like the sudden unraveling of a well-worn lie. Elaine's composed voice and confident demeanor contrasted sharply with Amanda's faltering composure. Amanda, once confident in her ability to belittle and dismiss, was now on the defensive. I didn't know," Amanda stammered, the confidence she had shown earlier evaporating into thin air. The sharp, mocking tone that had once laced her words was now replaced by an unmistakable fear. Elaine shook her head slowly. "You didn't know who you were dealing with, but I'm a professional, a lawyer, and I don't take these things lightly." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She could see Amanda squirming, the reality of the situation settling in as the other passengers began to stir, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding drama. "You see, this isn't just about a ripped dress. It's about race, it's about power, and it's about respect." Elaine's gaze was unwavering as she looked around the cabin. The passengers, who had been silent observers up until now, were beginning to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others looked at each other with wide eyes, realizing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a mere disagreement. This was a confrontation that spoke to something much deeper, something rooted in systemic inequalities and the harsh realities of power dynamics. Amanda's response was nothing more than a stuttered apology, her voice shaky. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." But the words felt hollow. They lacked sincerity, and Elaine could tell she was only apologizing because she realized the magnitude of the situation, not because she truly understood the gravity of what she had done. Elaine raised her hand, silencing her. "It's too late for apologies, Amanda," she said, her voice steady, but now carrying an edge of authority that sent a shiver down the flight attendant's spine. "You can't take back what you've done. You've humiliated me, and now you've also humiliated yourself." She paused, her expression hardening. "I'll be speaking to your manager when we land, and believe me, I'll make sure this is handled properly." Amanda, now visibly shaken, glanced around the cabin, her eyes flicking from one passenger to the next. She must have realized that this wasn't just a matter of one angry passenger. It was something that would be noticed, something that could have serious consequences for her. The color drained from her face as the realization settled in. This was no longer just about a personal clash between her and a passenger. This was about an attorney, someone with the power and influence to make things very difficult for her and for the airline. Elaine's calm was the perfect foil to Amanda's panic. The power dynamics had shifted entirely. What had begun as a petty confrontation had turned into something far more serious, something that had left Amanda at a distinct disadvantage. The rest of the passengers were watching with a new sense of awareness, as though the plane itself had tilted on its axis. Elaine's eyes remained steady as she met Amanda's gaze one last time. "You've made a mistake," she said quietly, but the words carried a weight that resonated in the now still cabin. "But you'll learn from this." As the flight continued, the conversation was over, but the tension, the shifting power, the underlying issues, those lingered in the air long after the encounter had ended. The story of what had happened on Flight 329 was not one that would remain contained within the walls of the airplane. The incident quickly spread like wildfire across social media, igniting a frenzy of reactions, debates, and fierce discussions about race, power, and discrimination. Within hours, the hashtags #JusticeForLane and #RacistFlightAttendant were trending on Twitter. News outlets picked up the story, giving it wide coverage across television, online news platforms, and blogs. Elaine had gone from being an ordinary passenger to a symbol of resilience and grace in the face of adversity. Her calm and collected response to Amanda's blatant disrespect had captured the public's attention, and people were rallying around her, praising her poise and demanding justice. A video of the confrontation, captured by a fellow passenger, had gone viral, showing Elaine standing tall in the face of Amanda's demeaning comments, the ripped fabric of her designer dress a visible mark of the flight attendant's aggression. The video spread across platforms, with thousands of people commenting on the injustice they had witnessed. Public opinion quickly shifted. Where once there had been whispers of "she probably overreacted," or "maybe it was just a misunderstanding," now people were taking to social media in droves, condemning Amanda's behavior. The hashtag racist flight attendant was flooded with angry tweets and posts, many users recounting similar experiences of mistreatment in public spaces. Some even shared their own stories of racial bias in the workplace, which seemed to echo Elaine's experience. The media jumped on the story, with anchors and reporters dissecting the situation from all angles. News outlets published in-depth analyses of the power dynamics between flight attendants and passengers, and the subtle but pervasive nature of racial prejudice in everyday interactions. Experts weighed in on how small acts of racism, often dismissed as incidental, were in fact deeply rooted in societal systems. But the media's focus wasn't only on the incident itself, it was also on the emotional toll this kind of encounter had on the victim. Talk show hosts invited Elaine onto their platforms to discuss not just the flight, but the broader societal issues at play. Elaine's words, calm but firm, resonated with the public. She didn't just speak out for herself, but for the countless others who had been silently enduring discrimination in all its forms. Her personal story, now intertwined with her professional expertise, had turned her into an advocate for racial justice. In a statement to the press, Elaine confirmed she was considering legal action against the airline for emotional distress and racial discrimination. Her team of lawyers, one of the best in the field, was already drafting a formal complaint. "This is not just about a ripped dress," Elaine had said in an interview. "It's about how these small actions are part of a larger system of discrimination that needs to be dismantled. I will fight for justice, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever been made to feel less than." Her words were clear and powerful, and the public was listening. Legal analysts speculated that Elaine's case had the potential to set a precedent for similar claims, possibly changing the way airlines, and even other industries, address racial bias within their workforce. The question on everyone's mind was, would the airline, in light of the evidence and mounting public pressure, take swift action? Would they attempt to smooth over the issue, or would they stand behind their employee, Amanda? Amanda, on the other hand, was facing the consequences of her actions. The airline, after an internal investigation, confirmed that they had placed Amanda on paid leave pending further inquiry. The pressure from the public and the media had reached a boiling point, with calls for her termination echoing across social media. Amanda's once steadfast support from her colleagues seemed to dwindle as the fallout from the incident deepened. In interviews, Amanda had attempted to apologize, but her words rang hollow to many. She had tried to explain herself, stating that she never intended to offend anyone, but her explanations only seemed to magnify the ignorance behind her behavior. The more she spoke, the more her demeanor appeared to shift from contrition to defensiveness. Her personal life had been turned upside down as well. Friends and family who had once defended her now found themselves backing away from the controversy. Amanda, who had never expected the incident to spiral into a national conversation about racism and systemic bias, was now grappling with the reality of public outrage. The emotional toll on Amanda was immense. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She had become the face of the ugly side of the service industry's racial biases, and no amount of apologies seemed to be enough to undo the damage she had caused. There were whispers of her possibly losing her job, or at the very least, being reassigned to another position within the airline. Elaine, meanwhile, continued to maintain a composed exterior, though those close to her could see the weight of the situation taking its toll. She'd been thrust into the spotlight, but she never lost sight of the larger picture. This was about making a statement, about challenging the status quo, and about demanding accountability. She began to speak at rallies and protests, using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been similarly affected by systemic discrimination. The emotional toll on Elaine, while certainly heavy, was more of a catalyst than a hindrance. She had become a symbol of courage, someone who had stood up for herself and others when the odds were stacked against her. But the media frenzy, the endless interviews, the discussions, and the public outcry began to wear on her. She was no longer just a lawyer. She was a movement, and with that came enormous pressure. As the investigation into the airline's role in Amanda's actions continued, people were asking themselves bigger questions. How many other stories like Elaine's had gone untold? How many other passengers had been disrespected, ignored, or dismissed by flight attendants or service workers? Elaine's case had ignited a firestorm, but it also became a platform for change. While Amanda's fate hung in the balance, Elaine's advocacy for racial justice and equality was just beginning. The true power of her story wasn't in the legal battle that lay ahead, but in the way it inspired others to demand respect, accountability, and fairness. In the end, this was no longer about a single confrontation. It was about a society that was finally waking up to the pervasive nature of racism. Elaine's fight was one that reached beyond the boundaries of an airplane cabin. It was a fight for dignity, for justice, and for the world to finally see what had been hiding in plain sight. The fallout from Flight 329 was far from over, but its long-term impact on the lives of Elaine and Amanda, as well as on the airline industry and society at large, became increasingly apparent. The incident, once a tragic misunderstanding between two individuals, had sparked a firestorm of conversation about race, power, and respect that reverberated beyond the airplane cabin and continued to shake the public for months to come. For Elaine, the aftermath was transformative in ways she had not anticipated. What had started as a single act of personal injustice had snowballed into a public crusade for racial justice. The media attention, while intense and overwhelming at times, had also given her a platform to share her experiences and speak out about the systemic racism that so many people faced but rarely had the chance to expose. In the months following the incident, Elaine became a sought-after voice for social justice. News outlets frequently requested her insights on race relations, and she was invited to speak at national conferences and forums on racial discrimination and advocacy. Her calm demeanor and measured approach to speaking about racism, paired with her status as a respected attorney, gave her an unparalleled authority on the subject. As someone who had worked tirelessly in the courtroom, she now used her influence to raise awareness about racial bias in public spaces and institutions. Her career also received a remarkable boost as a result of the attention. High-profile law firms and advocacy groups reached out to her, eager to work with someone who had proven she could handle public scrutiny with grace while advocating for meaningful change. Her firm received a surge in clients who were drawn to her commitment to fighting injustice. People who had once seen Elaine as a quiet, reserved professional were now in awe of her ability to balance her legal expertise with her dedication to social causes. Elaine's influence extended beyond her professional life. She became a central figure in grassroots movements, participating in protests and marches, and lending her voice to campaigns aimed at dismantling systemic racism. Her commitment to using her newfound platform for good was clear, and she made sure to speak out not just for herself, but for those who, like her, had endured similar experiences in silence. The changes in the airline industry were not as immediate, but were substantial in the long run. The incident had forced the airline to reevaluate its policies regarding discrimination and how its employees handled sensitive situations. Under increasing pressure from the public and media, the company issued a public apology to Elaine and announced that they would be rolling out a new, comprehensive anti-racism training program for all employees. In addition to the training, the airline made a commitment to reviewing their employee disciplinary processes to ensure that racial bias, whether overt or subtle, would not be tolerated. The leadership of the airline faced immense criticism for allowing the situation to escalate, but they promised to institute long-term reforms aimed at creating a more inclusive and respectful environment for both employees and passengers. Amanda's career, however, had not fared nearly as well. The intense public backlash was devastating. She was suspended indefinitely from her job, and while the airline promised an internal investigation, it was clear to everyone that her actions had irreparably damaged her reputation. Her public apology, though sincere, failed to convince many that she truly understood the gravity of her actions. Amanda's behavior, once dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment, was now exposed as part of a larger, deeply ingrained issue of racial bias. The emotional toll on Amanda was severe. She became a subject of ridicule on social media, with many users not only calling for her dismissal, but also questioning her sincerity. Her colleagues, many of whom had once stood by her, now struggled to reconcile their perception of her with the incident that had gone viral. Amanda's life had been upended in a way she had never imagined. No amount of apologies could repair the damage to her career and personal life. Some people in her circle tried to defend her, claiming that she hadn't meant any harm, but the broader narrative was one of personal reckoning. The incident had forced her to face her own biases, and the realization that her actions had profound consequences. In the months following the confrontation, Amanda found herself grappling with questions of privilege, race, and the discomfort of confronting her own actions. The public scandal had brought her face to face with the fact that her actions were not just isolated incidents, but a reflection of a deeper societal problem. She had become an unwilling symbol of the larger systemic issue of racism that Elaine had been fighting against for years. On a personal level, both Elaine and Amanda were changed by the experience, but in starkly different ways. Elaine emerged from the incident with a renewed sense of purpose and strength. Her voice, once reserved for the courtroom, had become a rallying cry for justice, and she now stood as a beacon of hope for others who had been silenced by discrimination. The woman who had quietly walked onto Flight 329 that day was no longer just an attorney. She had become an advocate for change, a leader in the fight against racial injustice. Amanda, on the other hand, found herself at a crossroads. The incident had shaken her to the core, forcing her to reconsider everything she had known about herself, her privilege, and the world around her. While she began to see the need for personal growth, the road to redemption would be long and fraught with public scrutiny. She would have to work hard to regain the trust of her colleagues and confront her own internalized biases, but the damage to her career and personal life was done. In the end, Flight 329 had not just been a moment of confrontation between two people, it had sparked a much larger conversation about race, power, and societal responsibility. The repercussions of that single incident rippled outwards, affecting not just the lives of Elaine and Amanda, but also the policies of the airline and the broader social fabric. What had started as a personal injustice had grown into a public reckoning, reminding us all that sometimes the smallest sparks can ignite a fire of change. The story of Flight 329 serves as a powerful reminder of the deep-seated issues of racism and the power dynamics that shape our interactions. Elaine's fight for justice and Amanda's downfall illustrate the broader societal impact of personal struggles. In the end, we are left with the realization that these events are not isolated. They speak to a much larger conversation about equality, respect, and the ongoing fight for social justice. As we reflect on the long-term consequences of this incident, we are reminded that even small acts of discrimination can have lasting effects. The story of Elaine and Amanda challenges us to think about our own role in shaping a more just society. It urges us to recognize the power we hold in our everyday actions and to work towards creating a world where respect, dignity, and equality are afforded to everyone, regardless of their race or background. Ultimately, this story reminds us that while personal struggles are painful, they can also be the catalyst for much-needed change. It is in these moments that we must ask ourselves, how can we, as individuals and as a society, rise to the occasion and ensure that the injustices we witness are not allowed to continue unchecked?